My name is Emily Carter. I'm 29 years old, and I didn't realize I had already lost my place in my own family until the night they said it out loud and laughed like it was nothing. It happened on a Sunday evening in late October in my parents' dining room in Columbus, Ohio. The kind of dinner we'd had 100 times before. Same table, same neutral conversations, same unspoken rule that we avoided anything uncomfortable so everyone could pretend we were close. My older brother had just announced he and his wife were moving across the country for a new job. Everyone congratulated them, glasses clinked, smiles all around. Then my mother sighed and said, half joking, "Well, Emily will have to step up even more now." I smiled automatically. That was my role. I always stepped up. Then my aunt leaned back in her chair, chuckled softly, and said, "I mean, that's why Emily's still here anyway. She's the reliable one, the backup." The word hung in the air. Backup. My brother laughed. My father shook his head like it was obvious. Someone added, "You know what they mean. You don't mind. You're steady." No one looked at me. No one asked if I was okay. They just kept eating, talking, moving on, like they hadn't just reduced my entire existence to a contingency plan. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it on the table because my hands were shaking and I needed something small to control. I remember thinking, so this is how they see me. Not as a daughter with her own life, not as a sister who sacrificed time, opportunities, and silence to keep the peace. Just the one who stayed behind in case someone else didn't. That night, I drove home in silence, the radio off, the streetlights blurring past my windshield. I kept replaying the laughter, not cruel, not malicious, just casual, familiar, as if what they'd said was a harmless truth everyone already knew. If you've ever been called the strong one so often that no one noticed when you started disappearing, you already understand what broke inside me that night. And if this story sounds uncomfortably familiar, stay with me, because that dinner wasn't the end. It was the moment everything finally became impossible to ignore. I didn't confront anyone that night. I didn't send a message. I didn't demand an explanation. I went home, took off my coat, and sat on the edge of my bed with the lights still on, staring at the wall like it might explain something I'd missed. Because here's the part that hurt the most. I hadn't stayed behind because I had nothing else. I stayed because I believed that being dependable mattered. I believed that showing up counted for something. I believed that if I kept the family running smoothly, I'd eventually be seen, not praised, not celebrated, just seen. For years, I had been the one who adjusted. I moved my schedule around so I could help my parents when they needed it. I skipped trips, turned down job opportunities out of state, stayed local just in case. When someone needed a ride, a favor, a neutral third party to calm things down, my phone was the one they called, and I answered every time. I told myself that was what love looked like: quiet, reliable, uncomplicated. When my brother had his first child, I was the one who filled in when babysitters canceled. When my parents argued, I was the one who listened to both sides without taking one. When holidays got tense, I was the buffer, the peacemaker, the steady presence everyone leaned on without ever asking how much weight I was carrying. No one forced me into that role. That's important. I stepped into it willingly because I thought that if I made myself useful enough, essential enough, I'd never be disposable. I used to tell friends, half joking, I'm the responsible one in my family. They'd laugh and say, that's a good thing, and I believed them. That belief is dangerous because slowly, without realizing it, I stopped asking myself what I wanted. I didn't think about where I might live someday or what kind of life I wanted to build. I planned around everyone else's needs first, assuming there would be time for mine later. There's a particular kind of sadness that comes from realizing you weren't taken for granted because you were weak, but because you were consistent. That night after dinner, I opened my calendar and scrolled through years of reminders I'd set for other people. Appointments, birthdays, pickups, check-ins, things I'd done out of care, not obligation. And for the first time, I wondered if my absence would even be noticed, or if it would just be inconvenient. I wasn't angry yet, not really. I was grieving something quieter, the version of myself who believed loyalty would be returned, the version of myself who thought being the safe one meant being valued. I went to sleep telling myself I was overthinking it, that they hadn't meant it that way, that families joke, that I was being sensitive. But something had shifted, a hairline crack, barely visible, running straight through the story I'd told myself about where I belonged. And once you see a crack like that, it's impossible to stop noticing how much the structure depends on you pretending it isn't there. The anger didn't come all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as clarity. A few days after that dinner, my phone rang while I was at work. It was my mother. Her voice sounded normal, too normal. She asked if I could stop by later that week to help sort through some paperwork, insurance forms. "It'll be quick," she said. "Your brother's busy with the move." There it was again, the assumption, the entitlement dressed up as practicality. I agreed, out of habit more than choice, and as I drove over that evening, something hardened in my chest. Not sadness this time, something sharper. While we sat at the kitchen table, my mother shuffled papers and talked about logistics. At one point, she said, almost casually, "You don't mind handling this stuff. You're not really tied down like your brother is." I looked up. "What do you mean by that?" She paused, surprised by the question. "You know, you don't have kids. You don't have a big career move. You're flexible." Flexible, a nicer word for expendable. I felt my jaw tighten. So because I made different choices, I'm expected to pick up everyone else's slack? She frowned. "Emily, don't make this into something it's not. We just know we can count on you." That sentence cracked something open, because being counted on isn't the same as being considered. Later that week, I heard from my cousin. She mentioned, without malice, without drama, that there had been conversations after I left the dinner table, that my brother had joked about how lucky it was I didn't have anywhere else to be, that my aunt had said, "Well, at least Emily will always be around." Always. Like furniture, like a fixture that didn't get a vote. No one had meant to hurt me. That's what made it worse. This wasn't cruelty born of anger. This was truth spoken without fear of consequences. They didn't think they could ever leave. That realization lit the fuse. I replayed moments from the past with new ears. The way my plans were treated as tentative, my time as optional. The way praise came in the form of relief. "Thank God Emily can handle it." Never in the form of appreciation. I wasn't angry because they needed help. I was angry because my willingness had been mistaken for consent to be diminished. There's a specific kind of rage that comes from being reduced to a role you never auditioned for, from realizing people don't see your boundaries because you've always smoothed them out for their comfort. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand answers. I wanted someone to look at me and say, "We were wrong." But the truth was heavier than that. They didn't think they were wrong. They thought this was how things worked. And in that moment, standing alone in my apartment, the anger finally settled into something colder, clearer, and far more dangerous to the life I'd been living. I wasn't angry because they hurt me. I was angry because they never thought they could. The anger burned hot for a while, then burned out. What was left after that was emptiness. I didn't announce anything. I didn't confront my family. I simply stopped. I stopped answering calls right away. I stopped rearranging my schedule. I stopped filling the silence with solutions. And in the quiet that followed, I finally heard how tired I was. One night, I sat alone in my apartment with the lights off, the city humming faintly outside my window. My phone lay face down on the table. I didn't want to see who might need something from me next. I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out the center of my chest and forgotten to put anything back. For the first time, I asked myself a question I'd avoided for years. Who am I if I stop being useful? That question terrified me. I realized how much of my identity had been built around being needed, how often I'd measured my worth by how smoothly things ran for everyone else. When you live that way long enough, you start to believe that love is conditional, that it's something you earn by staying convenient. That belief collapses slowly, then all at once. I thought about all the times I'd told myself, this is just a phase. Once things settle down, I'll focus on my life. But things never settled. There was always another crisis, another favor, another reason my needs could wait. The grief didn't come from losing my family. They were still there. It came from realizing I'd been quietly absent from my own life. I lay awake that night replaying memories I'd once dismissed as insignificant. The jokes, the assumptions, the way decisions were made without me because I was expected to adapt. I saw the pattern clearly now, and it made my stomach twist with a mix of shame and sadness. I wondered if I'd done this to myself. That's the cruelest part of hitting bottom, not just feeling betrayed, but questioning whether you deserve it, whether you taught people to treat you this way by never asking for more. The next morning, I went to work and barely made it through the day. My body moved on autopilot while my mind stayed stuck on that dinner table, that word backup, echoing louder each time I tried to push it away. By the time I got home, I sank onto the floor of my living room and let myself cry for the first time since it all began. Not loudly, not dramatically, just silent tears, heavy and relentless, soaking into the sleeves of my sweater. I cried for the years I'd postponed, for the boundaries I'd never drawn, for the version of myself who believed she had to stay small to belong. That was the lowest point. Not anger, not confrontation, but the quiet understanding that if I didn't change something now, I would disappear entirely. And sitting there on the floor, surrounded by a life that suddenly felt borrowed instead of chosen, I understood one painful truth. Nothing was going to save me from this but me. The shift didn't happen overnight. There was no dramatic morning where I woke up healed, motivated, and suddenly brave. What happened instead was quieter and far more permanent. A few days after that night on the floor, I met my friend Lauren for coffee. I hadn't planned to say much. I mostly needed to sit somewhere that wasn't my apartment. She listened while I spoke in fragments, filling in the gaps with long pauses and half-finished thoughts. At one point, she set her cup down and said gently, "Emily, when was the last time you made a decision that wasn't shaped around someone else's comfort?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. I couldn't answer. That silence was different from the others. It wasn't heavy with grief. It was clean, honest. On the drive home, I realized something that felt both relieving and terrifying. No one had actually told me I couldn't leave this role. I had stayed because it felt safer than facing the uncertainty of who I might be without it. That night, I did something small but deliberate. I didn't answer my phone. The next morning, I didn't rush to return messages. I went for a walk before work, even though it meant being a few minutes late. I noticed how tense my shoulders had been for years, how shallow my breathing felt when I was always on standby. Later that week, my mother called again. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened, there was no emergency, just another request wrapped in familiarity. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilty. That was the moment I understood control wasn't about confrontation. It was about withdrawal, about choosing where my energy went instead of offering it automatically. I didn't make a speech. I didn't explain myself. I simply began responding differently. "I can't do that this week. That doesn't work for me. I'll need you to find another solution." Each sentence felt awkward at first, like wearing shoes that hadn't been broken in yet. But with every boundary I set, something inside me steadied. There was pushback, confusion, a few comments about how I was acting different lately. I didn't argue, I didn't defend. I let the discomfort sit where it belonged, with them. I started scheduling my life the way I'd always planned everyone else's. I signed up for a class I'd postponed for years. I accepted an invitation out of town without checking if it inconvenienced anyone. I stayed home on weekends simply because I wanted to.
And slowly, the fog lifted. I wasn't becoming selfish, I was becoming visible to myself. The clarity that came with that realization was sobering. I saw how easily love can turn transactional when you're the only one making adjustments, how roles, once accepted, become expectations. I didn't need permission to step out of it. I needed courage. By the time I finally sat down and wrote a message to my family, short, calm, unapologetic, I wasn't asking for understanding. I was stating a fact. I was no longer available to be anyone's backup plan. And for the first time in a long while, that decision felt like choosing myself. Not in anger, not in spite, but in quiet self-respect.
The consequences didn't arrive with fireworks. There was no dramatic confrontation, no tearful apologies at my doorstep. What happened instead was quieter and far more revealing. At first, nothing seemed different. Then the cracks began to show. My mother called more often, her voice edged with confusion instead of certainty. "Can you help with this?" she asked once, then paused when I said no. My brother missed a deadline he'd assumed I'd quietly manage. A small family disagreement escalated because there was no neutral party smoothing it over behind the scenes. Without me absorbing the friction, everyone felt it. I heard through relatives that things felt tense lately, that communication was off. Someone joked that I must be busy living my life now. The comment was meant lightly, but it carried a realization they hadn't expected. I was no longer available by default. No one apologized outright. That would have required admitting something uncomfortable, that my constant presence had made their lives easier at the expense of my own. Instead, there were tentative gestures, invitations phrased like tests, requests softened with compliments. "You've always been so good at this." "No one does it like you. We just figured you wouldn't mind." I didn't take the bait. What surprised me most was how quickly the dynamic shifted when I stayed consistent, when I didn't explain myself, when I didn't step in to rescue moments of awkwardness. The system recalibrated without me at the center of it, and I felt lighter. Not triumphant, not vindictive, just free from the constant low-level exhaustion I'd mistaken for responsibility. One afternoon, my brother stopped by unannounced. He stood awkwardly in my doorway, hands in his pockets, eyes darting around my apartment like he was seeing it for the first time. "Mom says you've been distant," he said evenly. "I've been busy," I replied evenly. "With what?" I smiled. "With my life." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I guess we didn't realize how much you were doing." I didn't correct him. Realization, I'd learned, works best when it arrives on its own. The satisfaction didn't come from watching anyone struggle. It came from noticing how calm I felt saying no, and meaning it, from recognizing that my worth hadn't diminished just because I stopped making myself endlessly available. I hadn't punished anyone. I'd simply withdrawn a privilege they'd mistaken for a guarantee. That was the balance I'd been missing before. Consequences without cruelty, distance without bitterness, boundaries without drama. Some nights I thought about that dinner table again, the laughter, the word backup, and the way it had landed like a verdict. And instead of anger, I felt something steadier. Relief. Because the truth is, the greatest reckoning wasn't theirs. It was mine. I finally understood that being essential to everyone else had never made me essential to myself, and walking away from that role didn't break the family. It revealed what had been leaning on me all along. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after that. It became quieter, and at first that quiet felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling. I had spent so long reacting to other people's needs that the absence of constant demands left a strange echo behind. But slowly, that echo softened. I started noticing things I'd missed before. How mornings felt when I didn't wake up already behind. How my apartment sounded when there was no tension humming under the surface. how my thoughts moved differently when they weren't constantly interrupted by obligation. Nothing dramatic had changed. Most of the furniture was the same, the streets outside were the same, my family was still my family, but something essential had shifted inside me. I no longer edited myself before speaking. I no longer agreed just to keep things smooth. I no longer measured my value by how indispensable I was. That dinner months ago, the laughter, the word backup, used to replay in my head like a wound. Now it feels more like a marker, a line between who I was and who I chose to become. People ask sometimes if I regret pulling back, if I miss how things used to be. I tell them the truth. I miss the idea of being valued for who I was, not for what I provided. But I don't miss being invisible. There's a difference between being loved and being relied on, between being chosen and being convenient. It took me far too long to understand that. Some betrayals don't come with shouting or slam doors. They come wrapped in familiarity, in jokes, in assumptions, in the quiet confidence that you'll always be there to pick up the slack. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't confronting the people who hurt you. It's listening carefully when they show you who you are to them and believing it. I didn't leave my family. I left a role that was slowly erasing me. And in that space, I found something steadier than approval: self-respect. If you're listening to this and something feels uncomfortably familiar, I want you to know this: being dependable doesn't mean being disposable, and being strong doesn't mean you owe everyone access to your life. You're allowed to step back. You're allowed to choose yourself. You're allowed to stop being someone's backup plan. Sometimes clarity costs you comfort, but it gives you something better in return: yourself.